And to talk more about the life of Robert Hughes, we're joined by Liberal frontbencher Malcolm Turnbull, who was a close friend. His wife Lucy is the niece of the esteemed art critic. Malcolm Turnbull, thanks very much for coming in, and what no doubt has been a tough day for you. How good was Robert Hughes as a critic, as a writer and a historian?
He was the best. He wrote the best read history of early Australia, Fatal Shore. It really unveiled for the first time the grotesque brutality of the convict system. You know, everyone in Australia knew that the country had been initially settled by convicts and been set up as a penal colony. But Bob really lifted the lid on the monstrous sadism and brutality of the system. You know, his description of Joseph Favreau, the superintendent of Norfolk Island, and the horrible sadistic floggings and torture of convicts. This really was causing us to confront our own history. And there's a street in Sydney named after him, so it's one of the great sadists of all time, is memorialised forever in our city.
And as an art critic?
Well, he was a remarkable art critic. He's been described as the best art critic. He certainly was the leading art critic during all the time he worked at Time magazine. And of course his series Shock of the New, which really looked at the rise of modernism, you know, through to Warhol, I guess, that was of a quality and an importance equalled only, I would think, by Ken Clark's Civilization series. So, you know, if you're looking at the history of Western art, you could start with Ken Clark and then finish with Robert Hughes. Obviously, quite a lot's happened since, you know, the end of the period that Shock of the New covers. And he, you know, he also had a very deep sensibility and understanding of the Spanish mind, and in particular the mind of Catalonia. He wrote a wonderful book about Barcelona. But his work on Goya is really insightful. Goya was a painter of many things. He lived to an incredible old age, so he painted many things, from court portraits to paintings of the brutalities of the Napoleonic War. But he's probably best remembered, I think, for the work he did of people that were insane, of the brutality of war. In some ways prefiguring, Picasso's Guernica. That iconic portrait or painting of the bombing of that town by the Nazis. And Bob had a real understanding of an insight into horror. And of course, a lot of that came back to him in the wake of his terrible accident.
What was he like as a person? You spent a lot of time with him, particularly with his convalescence after that accident.
Yeah, well, Bob was very badly smashed up, and Lucy, in particular, spent a lot of time with him in Perth. She was, over there caring for him. And once he got out of the intensive care unit, we brought him over to the East Coast, and then sprang him out of hospital a little earlier than the doctors wanted, I might add, so he could stay with us at home. And he, I think that was very important for his recovery. But he was always, both then and before and subsequently, he was always amazingly good company. And, for an art critic and someone who was a great public intellectual, Bob's great pleasures were not at all the cafe latte set type of things. I mean, in fact, he used to send up the that type of mindset. I remember when he was campaigning with us in the Republican referendum, because he was in Australia in '99, mostly convalescing, and we wheeled him out every now and then, literally, in fact, in a wheelchair, to deliver some speeches. And on one occasion, he stood up to this audience of enthusiastic Republicans and he said, "Welcome, Chardonnay swilling elitists."
But he was an elitist himself. He wasn't a social elitist, but he was a cultural elitist, wasn't he?
Yeah. Well, he believed in excellence. He wasn't he was certainly not a social elitist, and that's the point I was really making before I distracted myself. He was at his happiest when he was with fishermen, with hunters, with farmers, with practical people. I mean, he loved fishing and he loved hanging out, doing practical, blokey things.
How did you meet him?
Well, obviously Lucy is his niece, and he's been part of, Lucy's been part of his family and vice versa for all of their lives. But I actually met Bob in New York when I was doing, in 1976, I think it was, I was doing a story for Channel 9 on Rupert Murdoch's takeover of the New York Post, and I just saw Bob out of the corner of my eye. I recognised him, and so I called him over and said to him, what do you think about Murdoch buying all these papers? And he gave his opinion, and then he added at the end, he said, of course, I worked for Murdoch once and he sacked me. And then when I interviewed Murdoch later to complete the package, I said to Murdoch, Robert Hughes said you sacked him. Why did you sack him? And Rupert's eyes narrowed just a little bit, and a sort of a dark cloud came across his face, and then this faint smile. And he said, I seem to recall an argument over the ownership of a case of champagne. And so Bob never confessed to it, but I always have this wonderful vision of the young Bob, the young cartoonist, sneaking into the proprietor's office and making off with the champers.
That rebellious streak is a theme in his life, and he tells a great story in his memoir about how he got the job at Time magazine in New York. He was in London, it was 1970, and he got a phone call from New York from someone reputing to be from Time magazine. But he had been smoking some marijuana, and he was so stoned and so paranoid that he hung up the phone because he thought it was the CIA. Now, thankfully, Time magazine called him back, and the reason why they wanted to employ Robert Hughes as an art critic was that he was able to make art accessible, and that was a real skill of his, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He was a great communicator, and that he's both in the written word and the spoken word. I mean, he spoke as eloquently as he wrote. Extempore, he spoke as eloquently as he wrote, and the big booming voice. It's quite interesting to compare him and his elder brother, Lucy's dad, Tom Hughes, the great barrister, and both of them, they have very similar voices, but Tom has a more forensic and precise mode of delivery, as you'd expect from a lawyer, whereas Bob is more generous and flamboyant. But he was a devastating critic. He hated what he thought was, frankly, the nonsense, the commercial, crass nonsense of a lot of modern art.
And he certainly went to town on a lot of those artists in the 80s.
And more recently, I mean, Damien Hirst is scathing about him. He wrote of Jeff Koons, the very hugely wealthy American artist. I think he said of him once that with Koons, nothing was lost in reproduction and nothing gained in the original.
Well, he said he once referred to the thrill of a good negative review as the beautiful release of tearing someone's leg off. He could be harsh, couldn't he?
Well, that's right. And of course, he didn't like criticism himself. Like a lot of critics, he didn't like to be criticised. But
he tore some legs off the postmodernists and also the politically correct in his book in 1993, The Culture of Complaint. And he also had some very prescient things to say about the US political system. I've got a quote here. He said, "Polarisation is addictive. It is the crack of politics, a short, intense rush that the system craves again and again until it begins to collapse." Now, he wrote that nearly 20 years ago. Did he see the damage that the polarisation of US politics could cause before others?
I think he did. And of course, it's got much, much, much worse, to the point where the American political system, in some respects, looks almost dysfunctional. Brings back to mind that great poem of Yeats. The things fall apart, the centre cannot hold.
Did you see a similar polarisation in politics in Australia?
Not so much. No. I mean, Bob always thought he didn't always agree with our politics or our politicians. He didn't always agree with me, for that matter. But he saw Australia as having a more civilised political system than the United States, and I think he was right there. I think American politics has become much more polarised than ours. I mean, one of the great advantages we have, frankly, is compulsory voting. Now, as a libertarian, I don't like saying that, but the problem in America with voluntary voting, of course, is that each side is driven to run arguments that appeal to their base in order to get the vote out. And so, whereas here, because everyone has to vote, the arguments are focused at the centre. And I think that gives us a better political system. It's still pretty partisan, of course, as you've no doubt observed.
What drove Robert Hughes to keep working so hard? I mean, American Visions gave him a nervous breakdown. He kept working after that horrific accident. What drove him?
Just insecurity. He was always anxious. You know, am I good enough? I mean, despite all of the honours and success, Bob was always plagued by doubt. You know, he said, he wrote of one of, you know, one of the great artists of the importance of doubt in his work. It may have been Caravaggio, I think, but Bob was filled with doubt, and that insecurity was the edge, you know, the edge of the blade that drove him onwards to write more and more, and to always aim to do better.
Of all his work, was there anything that you got a sense he was most proud of?
He was very, very proud of Fatal Shore. There's no doubt about that. Very proud about that. He was very proud of his book on Barcelona. He's proud of the work on Goya. And of course, Shock of the New was a classic. You know, it was and is and remains a great classic. If you know, every art student has got it on their reading list still. So he was extraordinary, and he was, you know, Bob, above all things, was a really formidable force of nature. He was an incredibly good company, a brilliant conversationalist, and a very good friend.
Malcolm Turnbull, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.